Again, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the final webinar in our webinar series, Dig Into Your Day with Cover Crops and Conservation. It's been really wonderful catching up with everybody on Monday and Thursday mornings. If you are interested in having more webinars, let us know. If you're feeling overwhelmed by all the webinars out there, that's fine too, but it's definitely been nice to have something to break up our days while we're in lockdown. so thanks everybody for attending the webinars. If you need CCA credits for today's webinar, please email Katherine. And with that, I'd like to introduce, excuse me, Cara Peterson. And Cara is joining us this morning from Maryland. Are you still in Maryland?
Yeah, I'm going to school in Maryland. I'm technically in DC right now, in my apartment in DC.
Oh, all right.
But
okay.
Yeah, I'm still at UMD.
Okay, I wasn't sure if you went home, or a lot of people are not where they're normally.
Yeah, I'm in my bedroom in my apartment in DC right now, but this is where I wish I was, which is the soybean fields over in Beltsville.
Awesome. Well, maybe this summer.
Yeah.
So Cara is a graduate research assistant in the Agroecology Lab at the University of Maryland with Dr. Katherine Tully, and she conducts her research with the Sustainable Agriculture Systems Lab at the USDA Beltsville Ag Research Center with Dr. Steve Mirsky that we all heard from. He was our first presenter. And she's wrapping up her master's project on integrating legume cover crops into the mid-Atlantic cropping rotation by drill interseeding cover crop mixtures into no-till double crop soybeans. Wow. So she's gonna talk about her projects today. So thank you, Cara. And with that, I'm gonna let you take over.
Great. Yeah, thanks for the intro. That's not my full master's thesis title, thank goodness. But I just wanted to get it all in there.
Yeah.
So I'm going to share my screen.
Yep.
So I can just pull up my presentation here. All right. So thank you so much for the introduction. Yeah. What we're trying to do here actually builds, I'm so glad that actually the presentations worked out this way, because I think that this presentation will build on a lot of things that Heather brought up on Monday. So we're also here in Maryland experimenting with types of interseeding cover crops into no-till double crop soybeans. And just a quick shout out to, there's my two advisors, Stephen and Kate, and then Mark Van Gessel from University of Delaware, where we did a trial with interseeding over at the Carvel farm, and then some postdocs and staff from both of the labs who've been helping me out with this research and writing, and have been really helpful. So first, just to go over the type of crop rotation that we're looking at here. It's a 2-year system with winter wheat, and then we've got double crop soybeans, and then this empty winter going into corn. And so at first glance, this looks like a great place to put in some cover crops, but there's some difficulties where, because it's a double crop soybean system, that means that they're often in the field pretty late into the season and far past when it would be usually ideal to plant legume cover crops. Also in this area in Maryland and Delaware, we have these cover crop programs where farmers get paid to plant cover crops, and the cutoff for any legumes, if you want to get the extra subsidy for legumes, is October 1st. Also, as Heather brought up earlier, I'm going to be saying that a lot because there's a lot of great things that Heather brought up on Monday that just go really easily, like just fit really well into this. Oops, back. So this is the kind of issue area that we're looking at here, is how to get legume cover crops into this system, established early enough to survive the winter, and also so that they can grow large enough in the springtime to make a difference in all of the wonderful ways that we use cover crops for. So we are trying out this interseeding, and like Heather mentioned, she's been playing around with interseeding, it sounds like, for a couple different time periods here, like earlier in the soybeans, later in the soybeans, and we are looking at the same thing. We only tried one time in the soybean crop, we basically interseeded just in late August, early September, just as the soybeans were beginning to canopy. And I'll be sharing the results of like how that worked out, and then how the cover crops grew, and then also how that impacted the corn the following year. And like on Monday, when we heard about the soybean yield coming after the cover crops, we planted corn in those fields and then measured how the corn was impacted throughout the season, and then also finally how the corn yield was impacted. So first, just a quick, some photos of the interseeder that we used. This is in a different field from previous corn studies interseeding corn studies in Pennsylvania. And then this is from our field when we interseeded the first year into these soybeans. And this is just what it looks like. We've got these 3 drills going between the wide row soybeans. And that's another important point, is that this interseeding took place in 30-inch row soybeans. And that's a big part of what we needed to test, is just the differences between 30-inch and 15-inch rows. And so you don't have to understand too much of all of this schedule here. Mainly, I just wanted to show the first year of the trials, where you have soybeans. And here farther south, soybeans, the double crop soybeans are usually planted in like mid-June to even early July, and then harvested mid-November and sometimes even into December. So we've got that, it's quite a bit later than a full season system. And also with the maturity groups, which was really an integral part of what Heather described on Monday, is that in Maryland, they tend to use maturity group 3 for double crop, and like 4 and 5, depending on how far south you go, for the full season beans. So there's a really big difference in the management and like the variety selections between the full season and the double crop season. And that's why I put in double crop soybean, double crop soybean, double crop soybean in front of everything that I'm describing, because it's different than the full season, and it's a pretty different system. And that's why we needed to take a look at how to interseed in this specific system, because in a full season soybean, usually those are harvested by mid-October, and then you have enough time to get in like a cereal rye, maybe not a legume, but it's not quite the same issue as having a standing double crop soybean field going into November, even December sometimes. Anyways, so these are the 5 fields that we interseeded into, and just this green bar here is the soybean, and then these stripes here are the cover crops. And so what this is showing is we interseeded into 5 fields, and this cover crop survived through the winter and into the spring in 3 of those. Now here in this field and this field, we interseeded, they sprouted, they germinated, and then they died. So I just wanted to show you that our general success rate for that. And here is just the row spacing and the cover crop treatments for this first year. So these are the cover crops that we tried out. We tried out cereal rye on its own, and then cereal rye plus 4 different types of legumes: hairy vetch, winter pea, red clover, crimson clover. And before we even get into all of the cover crop data and how the cover crops did, I want to focus in on how the soybeans performed, and also the difference between the 15-inch versus 30-inch soybeans, and then how the soybeans did with and without the cover crops interseeded into them. And just a note, so to back up a little bit, the way this worked is that we planted essentially a whole field in 30-inch soybeans, and then we went back in and we planted additional rows. We moved the tractor over a little bit and planted another row in between to do that 15-inch soybean. So basically for every round, every replicate of these cover crop treatments, we had 1 treatment plot, which was just 15-inch soybeans with no cover crops. So to mimic what most farmers in the area would do, just so we could compare piece by piece the just normal soybean growth versus what we were trying to test with the interseeding. And it was the same population. So there was no, sorry, I didn't say that correctly earlier. We didn't like double, there wasn't twice as many soybeans in the narrow rows as there were the wide rows. And so here we have the yields by the row spacing. And in 6 out of these 8 fields, there was no difference between the narrow and the wide row spacing. And I have over here, this is the megagrams per hectare, and then I also put in what that relatively is to bushels per acre. And there's definitely usually a decrease in yield with double crop soybeans because they have a much shorter growing season and they tend to be a lower maturity group, and so they're just smaller plants with like a lower yield in general. But we still had pretty, other than this 1 year here, we still had relatively good yield compared to statewide averages for double crop soybeans. And then in just these 2 fields here in 2019, there was a yield difference. There was a statistical yield difference between the narrow and the wide row. And that worked out to be about 3.5, 4 bushels and about 6 bushels per acre for these 2 fields. But overall, those are in 1 year. And this is last year when we had that really awful drought. And we haven't been able to pick out a clear pattern between what was different in this year versus these other 6 field sites, because these 2 field sites were also from last year. So we're not quite sure what would have caused that, but it's just interesting to see that there's really little difference in the row spacing treatments over these 3 years. So then moving on to the soybean yields with the cover crop treatments. So these are all wide row soybeans, each one of these. It just is that the red, this first bar in every graph, there was no cover crops interseeded into them. And then this kind of funky mustard green yellow here has just cereal rye. And then each one of these other bars is a cereal rye plus legume mixture. And so these are the soybean yields. And it was really interesting that there was no difference between the yields except for this 1 year. And there was one difference here, but it was kind of an anomaly. You can't really, for some reason, the cereal rye and hairy vetch yielded lower. However, in this year, you can see that there was a lower yield in all of the interseeded plots, most of them to the normal. But if you go back, you'll see also that that's this year that had pretty low yields overall. And so I also marked here, these are the 5 field sites where we interseeded. And of these 5 field sites, this field and this field is where the cover crops failed. So this is to kind of show you that the cover crops failed here, but there's still, even when the cover crops failed and when the cover crops were present, there was no difference in the soybean yields across. And like in here, and in here there was this difference, but there was no difference between like where there was no cover crop, and then these ones all had cereal rye and legume mixtures in them. All right, so this is again back to those 5 field sites where we interseeded, and 2 of them, the cover crops did not survive under the canopy. And this gets into, I think, again, built off of what Heather was talking about on Monday, the point that you interseed. And I think that it's probably, my guess is that it would change by latitude and just change with when is it optimal for your soybean crop in your area. So we interseeded in late August, early September. And that's at the point where you can see here, the soybeans were starting to canopy, but they were still letting quite a bit of light in. And there's a pretty big difference in the light transmission through the soybean canopy where the cover crop survived and where they didn't. I mean, 6 and 4% versus 40% is pretty significant. So I collected this light transmission data as kind of a secondary, just as we were interseeding. The day before we interseeded, I would go out and just measure the ambient light and then the light that was reaching the ground through the soybean canopy. if I was to do this in the future, again, I would set this up as a treatment and then kind of stagger it. So I had like maybe every 2 weeks or every week and a half, or we could hit certain benchmarks and see where the cutoff was for where, like how much light transmission you needed to be able to get these cover crops growing. Because the way that we had it working is basically there was enough sunlight coming through the canopy, just enough to get the cover crops started to germinate, to come up, and then they just had to hold on for like 3 weeks before the soybeans started to yellow and drop their leaves. And then you got lots and lots of sunlight coming through once the soybeans had reached maturity and started drying down and dropping all their leaves. And here's just some photos of that fall. So you can see, oops, it's going forward. So this is about a month and a half after interseeding. We've got cereal rye and winter pea on this side and cereal rye and crimson clover on this side. And you can see that they've got lots of light here and now. So this is where the cover crops were able to survive under that soybean canopy, just those couple of weeks. And now they have a lot of access to sunlight. And so I just wanted to share these photos. And then this is just a week later where there's so much more light, and you can see that the cover crops at this point are really only a couple inches tall. They just needed to kind of establish and then set there. And so they haven't grown too tall yet. And I think that also, just like Heather said on Monday, it's that difference between how tall the soybeans are, where those first soybean pods are, and then where the cereal rye, where it grows to. That's a really important relationship, so that you can maintain like a really nice clean soybean harvest without trimming too much of the cover crop, for the cover crop's health, but also because you don't want so much of the cover crop biomass getting into the combine, and you don't want it like messing with your moisture levels and then making it harder for the combine operation to clean off the soybeans. So this is, I feel like actually, because we just kind of looked at the soybean fields and we're like, they're about to canopy, we should interseed now. But it just worked out really beautifully that the cover crops only grew a little bit before soybean harvest, and they kind of reached this optimal level where they just got a little bit of a trim at harvest, but there wasn't a lot collected. And here's some more photos of the process of the whole progression through the fall and into the spring. So this is late September, just a few weeks after we interseeded, and you can see that there's like really not that much sunlight coming through, but we've got at least some. This is the winter pea and cereal rye mixture coming up. And then this is early November, right before soybean harvest. And this is right after soybean harvest, where you can see that they've been harvested and they've still got this nice cover crop biomass coming up, nice ground cover. And then this is in late April at termination. All right, so just to review, this is where we're moving into the cover crop biomass information. And then I wanted to share some of that with you. So here's some more photos of what the cover crop looked like in the spring. So it's after soybean harvest, it survived the whole winter, and now it's really coming up. So this is cereal rye and hairy vetch in our field at Hayden Farm in Maryland. You can actually see here, what I like about a lot of these photos is you can see where the soybean was, and you can see these 3 lines of, this is a good photo to see that. You can see this is where the soybeans were and where like the tires on the interseeder went through. No, sorry, they didn't go through there, but you can see just like where all 3 of these lines from the interseeder would have been and how much great ground cover you've got going on. This is the cereal rye and crimson clover. And then we've got cereal rye and red clover. It didn't perform quite as well in this field, but we were still able to collect some great samples. And then this is a great just overview of what our fields look like, where you'd have one long strip of no cover crop, and then this one over here is just cereal rye, and over here, I'm pretty sure this was cereal rye and winter pea that ended like about here until you got into another treatment. Just to give you a sense of the kind of scale that we did these field trials at. And so here are the the information and the data about our cover crop spring biomass. So it's a little bit, it changes from field site to field site, and there's some differences in the results from field site. But the important part is that I want to show you is that this is that 3,500 to 4,000 kilograms per hectare kind of benchmark that we look for cover crops to perform at. Is when they hit this amount of biomass is when you really start getting the most amount of like ecosystem services. They're really able to start providing all those great benefits. And here you can see that we only were able to reach that benchmark in this one field site. And this is the first year, MD1. This year is actually, this MD3 field is where I was just showing you those photos from. So this field is MD3, and so is this one and this one. And just to give you a feel for like how much biomass you really need out there to start seeing these benefits. But so this is that benchmark that we're trying to reach, and we only reached at this 1 year. And then there were some differences between which species performed the best. But also importantly, even at this 1 year, these darker bars are the cereal rye components of biomass. So with just cereal rye, we would have barely reached that benchmark, but it was really the legume components of the mixtures that pushed it over that benchmark. So we got a good bump from those. And you can see that here as well is that the cereal rye performed okay on its own, but it was the legumes that really were able to boost up and even make the difference. So this is the reason we think that some of these didn't do as well as this one, is that this was 2018. We had really heavy rainfall right after we planted this field. And then this year, because of the really intense rain that fall, we actually were not able to get into the field to interseed until October. And this is where you can see what a difference that delay makes in the legume growth, because the rye did all right. Like the rye was fine, but we had such little legume cover crop biomass growth because it was delayed so long. And that is just really important, I think, when you're talking about cover crops and how when you're trying to integrate legumes into a cover cropping system, that you really have to pay attention. Like legumes are a different, they respond differently to delayed planting than cereal rye does. So this is the nitrogen levels in that biomass. And again, I'm just going to go back to the slide right before this, just to show you how in some of these areas, there was only a tiny amount of legume biomass. But when you go and you can see what a difference those legume biomass, what a difference that made in the overall nitrogen content of the cover crop in the spring. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit and we're going to go into corn. So we terminated our cover crop in late April, early May, and then we planted corn afterwards, because that's typically the rotation here in the Mid-Atlantic. Sometimes after corn, there will be a full year of soybeans for a third year, but there's a lot of this 2-year winter wheat, double crop, soybean, corn. So we planted corn afterwards. And then we measured some growth throughout the season and also just corn yield. And I'm going to kind of speed through the growth during the season because there weren't that many interesting differences. But just to get started on the corn year, so I don't know if you can see it because of the little bubble here, but the important thing to say is that out of all 9 of these field sites, 5 of them were interseeded, and then of those 3 where the cover crop survived, we planted corn on 2 of them. So you're going to be seeing a lot of just graphs of 2 fields after this. Okay, so we took each one of these fields that had each one of these cover crop plots, each one of these here, and they got divided into 6 nitrogen side dress treatments. So we had all of the corn received 30 pounds of nitrogen at planting, and then around V6, we side dressed with these 6 different treatments. And that was in order to try to get those lovely corn nitrogen response models. And I'll share the yield and show you what happened there. And here's some photos. You can see that this is one of the plots with no cover crop at all, versus here where you have a cover crop. And you can see, like, walking through the field, you could definitely tell the difference. Like, it was, it seemed very visually apparent where the cover crops had been, and also where there had been just cereal rye versus where there had been cereal rye and a legume. However, when we started looking at the data, there was actually not that many differences at all. So this is the first field. There was no difference at all between the leaf area index, the corn plant nitrogen content, or the chlorophyll content. We took a lot of SPAD readings at V6. And so at V6, this is before side dress, we had not put down any differences in nitrogen content. They all had gotten the same amount of starter fertilizer. And there really wasn't any difference in the growth, even though visually I thought that there was. Observationally, I was like, oh yeah, the no cover crops is definitely lower than the other ones, but this is why it's important to do this kind of research. And then in the second field at B6, the only cover crop treatment that really stood out was the cereal rye and winter pea. It was higher than the no cover crop for this leaf area index measurement, which is just like literally the leaf area. Like, you take all of the leaves off of the stem and you feed it through a machine and measure just that. It's like how much sunlight it would be catching, and kind of like a measurement of how large the plant is. And then the corn plant nitrogen content, the whole corn plant, we dried and ground up the whole corn plant and then measured the nitrogen. And again, the cereal rye and winter pea was higher, but there was no difference in chlorophyll content. And then later at R2, there were some differences in the plant height and the plant dry biomass, but they weren't very consistent from measurement to measurement. There was no real pattern that emerged. And then in the second field, this MD3, there were a few differences. There were interactions where it depended on which cover crop it was, which ones reacted to the nitrogen side dress treatment differently, but it wasn't a very clear, didn't show many clear patterns overall. Then we get to the corn yield response. And the first thing I want to point out here is that this is the first site year, and we had a pretty poor corn yield overall. This was the year, it was really heavy rains. The field was often had like pooled water on it. We had to take out a lot of treatment, a lot of plots out of the data because they were just completely underwater. And so overall, this is a pretty poor performing year. The second year performed a lot better. But also in both of these years, when we put down these nitrogen side dress treatments, we were trying to create a yield plateau essentially, and we did not find that. We did not find that yield potential, that upper maximum. So in a way we could say, yes, there was increases with the nitrogen treatments, but we didn't find out, we weren't able to really knock down that, or like lock down that number of how much nitrogen the cover crop had really replaced. And then, so just to also summarize this data, we found that in both of these years, there was no difference among the corn yield among the cover crop treatments. So the corn yield really responded more to the nitrogen treatment than it did the cover crop, except for one cover crop treatment in each year. And so in this year, this is the first year, all of the cover crop treatments, including the no cover crop treatment, kind of yielded the same, but then the cereal rye and hairy vetch was higher. And then in the second year, no cover crop and all of the cover crop treatments yielded the same, except for this hairy vetch, cereal rye and winter pea treatment. So we modeled this, we used a quadratic plateau, and this is just to show you that there was a little bit of a yield increase with these two treatments, but these are just 2 years, and so we didn't feel confident giving like a concrete which one's better. However, the good news, the interesting news, is that none of the cover crop treatments, none of the corn in the cover crop treatments yielded lower than where there was no cover crop. So just to quickly review all of this information really fast. is that of this 2-year system we've got going on, there was no soybean yield difference between the 15 and 30-inch rows overall. We didn't find a yield difference. And then little to no soybean yield difference between the cover crop treatments. You might remember that there was just one field where the cover cropped soybeans yielded lower, but on all the other ones, they were very similar. And then the cover crop biomass and nitrogen in the cover crop, it really varied from year to year. Some of that was caused by the weather. There was like some really extreme weather in there. And then also that the corn yield was pretty much either the same or yielded slightly higher in 2 of the cover crop treatments. So that was all of our research that we've been doing over the past 3 years. And I'll go and take anyone's questions. I'm really excited. I'm sorry that we got off a little bit late. We started a little bit late, so I kind of zoomed through here, but I would love to take anyone's questions if they come up. Oh, it looks like we have.
There we go. Sorry.
Oh, Bill Curran. Yeah, cool. Do you think that the cover crops would have done better if you interseeded earlier? Do you have any experience with grass and sugar? Yeah. So that's, yeah, the first question is.
Can you read the question, Cara?
Sorry? Oh, yeah, the question is.
Can you read the question in case people aren't seeing it?
Yeah, the question's from Bill Curran. Do you think that the cover crops would have done better if you interseeded earlier? That's a good question. I actually am skeptical of interseeding earlier because then the cover crops have to survive longer under the soybean canopy. But that's a really good, there might be a sweet spot, like even a week or 2 earlier before we did, and maybe not as early as some of the soybean interseeding has been done. And the second question is, do you have any experiences with grasses other than cereal rye? Ryegrass might have done better because of shade tolerance, right? I have not tried this with anything other than cereal rye, but that would be really interesting to test out for sure. And then what was the most successful legume? Any differences in biomass? Yeah, that's a great question. So we'll go back here to the, I want to go back to the cover crop data. And here you can say, see, get rid of that little, oh, I maximized it. And here we go. Cool. So I would say actually that cereal rye and the crimson clover, the crimson clover and the winter pea overall were just really, even not looking at the like this biomass data, there was really good solid ground cover. And I did take a bunch of NDVI information where you scan the field and then you can see like the amount of vegetation and you can compare the levels. And I did that throughout the winter and the early spring. And the crimson clover and the winter pea did really well with that. But I would say, so here, this is the year where overall we had really high biomass and like a good strong cover crop stand. And you can see that all the cereal rye and legume mixtures did really well. And then this one's interesting, I think, where this year we didn't have the best cover crop, but this is the crimson clover. And it's just, you can see how well that crimson clover did. And again, these solid bars are where there was just cereal rye, and the empty white bars are the legumes. So you can see that like even when the rest of the cover crops weren't growing very well, the crimson clover really held on. I mean, that's like almost equivalent to the year where it did really well. And then again, this year where the cover crops didn't do very well because they were planted so late, this is the cereal rye, crimson clover that again was able to produce some nice biomass by the spring, even though it was planted so late. Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you have any other?
Great. If there's any questions for Cara, please type them in the Q&A box or in the chat box. And I think Katherine is going to launch our quick poll for the day. And you could take a minute to answer that. That would be great. And Cara, how many, is this it? Are you writing up your thesis now, or?
Yep. Yep. I'm at that stage where my mom asks me every week, like, did you finish? How about now? Did you finish? Yeah, so I wrapped up my classes in the fall, and I'm just writing my thesis now. I postponed, I was supposed to defend originally like last week, but then because of this whole, I needed some more time, and then also because of this whole new situation, we postponed it a bit. And then I'm also staying on for my PhD at Maryland with Kate.
Oh, you are? Great.
Yeah.
Good. So what will you be studying next?
That's a great question. No, it'll still be something with cover crops and the nitrogen cycle probably, but we still have to sort that out.
Great. And are you working on this new precision sustainable ag project, or?
Not, I haven't been deeply involved with it. I've heard about it kind of on the periphery, but I'm really excited about, I'm sure that there's going to be all kinds of great research that's coming out of it. So I'm sure there'll be a component or two of it in my PhD.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, everyone, it looks like we're wrapping up on time. If there's any last questions for Cara, please type them in, and we'll see if we can fit in one more question. Looks like there's one more question, Cara. Were the costs of the interceder and cover crops compensated for with payments to producers?
Mm-hmm.
And at what rate of payment did you pay?
Yeah, so that is a really good question. So this research was conducted at the Beltsville Research Station. So we have an interceder there and buy the cover crops with the operating money. So we actually didn't do any on-farm field trials with this. We had some plans to, but then the weather wasn't cooperative, and it just gets really complicated to bring an interceder across the Bay Bridge. But that's a really good question. And so I know that there is a different type of interceder on the Eastern Shore where it's owned by the extension, like the county extension, and I think that they loan it out to folks. And then here in Maryland, also in Delaware, there's a subsidy program for cover crops that we actually study a lot because it influences how so many of the cover crops here are planted. And so there's a lot of interesting information out there about that as well. But that's a great question. Thanks, Myra.
Great. Well, thank you, Cara. Really appreciate you taking the time. And thanks everyone for joining us over the last few weeks for the cover crop webinar series. And again, if you're interested in more webinars, we're happy to keep hosting them. So let us know topics you want to hear about, and we'll see what we can pull together. And have a wonderful day. Cara, have a great day. And
Thank you.
Your thesis. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.